to today's interview with me, James Roy. I'm a producer here at WestWords. We're working on the land of the Dharawal people. Where are my two guests situated today? I was going to do introductions, but let's do this bit first. Where are you guys situated today? Judith?
I'm just outside of Canberra. I'm in Ngunnawal Ngambri country.
Right. And Louise, where are you at the moment?
I'm at home in the glamorous suburb of Helston Park.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. The people I'm talking with today, for the listeners, are Judith Crispin, who is a poet and was this year's winner of the Blake Prize, and Louise Carter, who is I think they called it highly commended, but I'm happy to call it runner-up. Are you more comfortable with that? That sounds like a...
It is fine.
Let's call it that. For anyone who doesn't know, the Blake Prize is a poetry prize that is run by the Casula Powerhouse Arts Centre, Liverpool City Council, and WestWords was involved this year as well. So we are here today to talk to the winner and the runner-up from this year's prize. So congratulations to both of you. For those of you who are listening at home or watching at home, the Blake Prize is a prize named after William Blake, who was an artist and a poet. And I've actually dug up a Blake quote that I think I might just share just at the moment. It's this one: "For everything that lives is holy, life delights in life." What do you think? How does that float your boat?
I think it's great.
Yeah.
I was shaking my head at the floating the boat comment.
Oh, right, I see. And so this prize is it's a poetry prize named for William Blake. We actually had, I don't know if you guys know this, but we had 480 entrants this year. Did you know that? Almost 500. So how does that make you feel? That's...
Although sad because I've been rejected for many things, so I know how that feels.
Well, that's the writer's life, isn't it? To be rejected for stuff. Yeah. What I was going to do, so let me introduce you both a little bit more formally. So Judith Nangala Crispin is a poet and visual artist of Paparawang. I'm really sorry, Judith. I practiced this because I'm told that the BP at the beginning of Pangarang is actually pronounced slightly differently, isn't it? Is it?
Well, you can pronounce it as a B or a P, which is why we've got both.
Oh, right. That's the thinking, is it? That's Murray River? Right?
Yeah, Pangarang people are from northeast Victoria and the New South Wales Riverina.
Right, okay. Nice country. And you're currently poetry editor of the Canberra Times. It says here that you live in a farmhouse near Lake George. It's a nice spot with your family, 2 cats, a fat Labrador and a dingo rescued from the desert. There's probably a story there. And you've got a couple of published collections of poems and called The Myrrh Bearers and The Lumen Seed.
Yeah.
So, and you wrote a poem for this award called On Finding Charlotte in the Anthropological Record, which is a lovely title. One of the things I really liked about this poem is that it's actually in the form of it's a block poem. And I'm a bit of a fan of the block poem. It kind of encourages you to read it a particular way, but we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And Louise Carter. Louise is a Sydney-based poet from Helston Park, as we've heard. Her work has appeared in Best Australian Poems twice, 2012 and 2015, Cordite Poetry Review, Meanjin, Westerly, Other Terrain Journal, and Seizure. So despite all those rejections that you were talking about a second ago, that's actually a pretty good back catalogue there. And you're a member of the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney University.
Yep.
So, and your poem was called History of Sadness. So what we're going to do right now is we are going to play your recordings. I originally was going to ask you to read, but what I thought we'd do is we'd just take a break now and we'll play your recordings. We'll start with yours, Judith, and then we'll have a little chat about that, and then we'll move on to Louise's.
On Finding Charlotte in the Anthropological Record. We meet on the surface of a photograph, as a fish and bird might meet in a lake, at a point of sky and the water's plain. Charlotte, in a book called The Aborigines of Northern Victoria, sits jade black on earth, wind disarranging her hair. Trees obscured by falls of campfire ash, her nudity is covered by a blanket. I don't know if her breasts are hanging, if her thighs bear designs or marks. A needlework of scars crosses her chest, repeated dots like patterns on a goanna's back, like rain spat by goannas into dirt. Soon constellations will appear over branches on this night of 90 years ago, this never again night, and she asks me, "Where did you go, girl, with your made-up history, your ever whiter babies?" This is what remains, a record of relatedness, scars to hold the memory of someone precious after they've died. We begin by cutting skin, rub wounds with gum and ash, black ants to cauterize the flesh. I remember them telling me, "Don't worry, this blackness fades with each generation." Charlotte is a map of a country stained by massacres, Skull Creek, Poison Well, Black Gin's Leap. A geography of skin and land, maps for the returning, for those who speak only a murderer's tongue, whose songlines are erased, who consulted departments of births, deaths and marriages, who stood beside rented Toyotas clutching photographs in 100 remote communities asking strangers, "Do you know my family? Can you tell me who I am?" This moment, an old light is crossing the boundaries of emulsion, and I say to her, "Charlotte, grandmother of my grandfather, I am Judith, and these are my scars."
So tell us a little bit more about this poem of yours, Judith. What was the inspiration behind this guy? What was the moment? Because one thing that we all do as writers is we all want to, or people who are interested in writing, we want to know where that first germ of an idea came from. That's the obvious question, and it's a good one to start with, I think.
Yeah, a friend of mine in Melbourne emailed me when I was actually in China at the time exhibiting some work, and I got this email asking me if I'd written any prose poetry, which I hadn't. And I thought I'd like to write some prose poetry because, you know, the idea was put there in my head, and I'm a bit like a goldfish that sort of fixate on whatever's right in front of me. But, you know, when you're trying a new form, I guess it's good to try to write about something that's very present in your mind at the time, something that is lived experience, because there's all that potency in lived experience. I think people can tell if you're just pontificating about something you don't really know. And really only a few months before that, I had come to what is probably the end of a 20-year search for my Aboriginal ancestry. And along the way, I learned just how almost impossible it is to track down Aboriginal ancestry, because the white record was constructed really to erase that ancestry. So when you have a country where there were no birth certificate issued until the 1960s, it's very difficult to follow the birth certificate route. And with all of these popular sites like Ancestry.com and so on, they rely on a pool of available DNA. So if you want to trace your English ancestors, this is very easy, but there's very little Indigenous DNA that's been submitted to those sites. And so in order to find that, you've really got to follow the oral history. You've got to go in person to speak with Indigenous people. And it's, you always end up with a result that's very mixed. Maybe you find the parts of your history that you're looking for, and you find a lot of parts of your history that you're not looking for as well. And I guess when I was thinking about writing this prose poem, I've sort of reached that point now where I'm thinking much less about what material is going to make a good poem, and more about what I actually want to say to people, because we're not immortal. You know, I'm 50 years old, you know, it's not quite dead, but, you know, there'll be a point where I'm not going to be speaking as much as I am now. And I thought what I'd really like to do is to just say something to those people that are out there now, you know, going from community to community, asking questions about their ancestry, not sure if they've even got any, not sure if they're going to find any answers, and just tell them that I know how it feels, that was really just what I wanted to do.
You start the poem talking about the surface of a photograph and a book. Was that a book, The Aborigines of Northern Victoria? Is that a book that you actually read and the poem kind of grew from there?
I was contacted by a Bangarang elder, Uncle Freddie, and he got in touch to say that he knew the names on my family tree. And I got in the car and went down to see him. And, you know, he was showing me all of these different family trees and things that he had in his possession. And I asked him if he had any photographs. And this was the only one that he knew of, which was in this book, which he pulled off his bookshelf and showed me. And the interesting thing was, in the photograph, this woman is exactly as I described her in the poem. But what I left out was there was a child sitting next to her in the poem. And the child was an absolute doppelganger of my daughter, just looked identical to her. It was like being struck by lightning, you know, when you suddenly see this resemblance and you think, well, you know, my doubt is gone now.
I was kind of really taken with the line where you talk about Charlotte is a map of a country stained by massacres, and then you name some of those sites. And just as a personal reflection, my daughter and I were driving up to Mudgee not that long ago from the Blue Mountains, and I recently saw that the massacre website, where it highlights all the different massacres around Australia, from the frontier conflicts, if you like. There were a whole bunch along that road out to Mudgee, like at places like Capertee and Turon Gates and so forth, that we were never told about. Is this something you've dug into a little bit more, the whole idea of these frontier wars that were never really reported because only one side was talking about them?
Yeah, I have. During this 20-year search where I was trying to track down ancestry, I was helped a lot by Central Desert people, especially Waltree people in the communities of Yuendumu and Ludjamunnu, which is sort of northwest of Alice Springs. And in the car, if I drive the 4 hours from Alice Springs to Yuendumu, I will pass 60 massacre sites. If the only ones I count are the ones that are named after massacres or the people that perpetuated them. There are probably many more, and those people are no longer with us to tell that story. So even that wonderful massacre map, which is being created at the University of New South Wales, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There was a huge unacknowledged genocide against Aboriginal people in this country. Even in the massacres, we don't, for example, include the huge numbers of people who we obliterated at Maralinga and Emu Field either. Mm-hmm. So I'm working on a book at the moment, and it lists as many of those massacre sites in that region as I can find. But I think if every person alive today were to write a list of the massacres that we all knew of, it would be a staggering list, and it would be an incomplete list.
I'd like to talk to Louise for a moment about your poem. So we'll just take a moment and we'll play that poem and then we'll talk about it.
History of Sadness. The window frames a pink dusk, dot matrixed through the fly screen. Miraculous is a bit much, but it's been nearly a season without sky. Smoke choked for so long, I'm a child noticing God for the first time. Bat silhouettes pass overhead in wobbly trajectories. I call Stephen from his scrubbing to watch the swirling silver and lilac curlicules of cloud, a magic trick or prophecy. Our eyes are still wet. He's intent on tricking the bats, clapping to send them off course. The heady stench of jasmine is aggressively feminine. Petals stream. I'm not clucky so much as I am tired of grief. Each month, the history of sadness congregates inside me, virulent. Ants swarm toilet paper in tissue boxes. I reach for a Kleenex and smear myself with peppery energy. Jesus. The dishwasher clicks and shushes. I could pray, but I'm not sure what to ask for. They're seeking fig trees and sex. In a cafe, I asked a magic 8-ball if everything would be okay, and it replied, yes. There's an old cockatoo that's been coming around, skeleton grey and mangy. The other birds squawk it away. Maybe it was a cruel person in another life. This is how I justify my actions when I spray mosquitoes and wasps. But don't bad people start as children who've been traumatised? I wanted to end the cycle. Grief is an addict, pleading. You'll do anything. I wasn't arguing with Stephen. I saw his side and agreed with it. There's an inner misalignment, like a car tyre that veers away from the highway. Hot nights dreaming of still alive cats in ballet exams. Sweat, the body crying. Struggling up staircases on torpid days. Unconquerable laundry hampers. Then change. Cool air, relief, rain. While sorting underpants, I get a response of sorts. Pay attention to whatever isn't pain. The room expands with subdued brightness.
So Louise, that was your poem, History of Sadness. I'm just going to read the judge's notes. This timely poem has smoke-choked assonance. It is domestic and feminine and the everyday. It bursts with resonances of the rising spirit in our shared grief in 2020. A poem of exhaustion, of trauma upon trauma, communal and personal, the devastation of bushfires, habitats and private griefs are set out in quiet, matter-of-fact couplets interwoven with a dazed tone of desperation and despair. Discuss.
Yeah, it makes it sound, well, I guess I advertise it correctly with the title. I wasn't setting out to write a devastatingly sad poem. And I think that there is humour and hope in it as well.
Indeed.
That's generally how I conduct myself through life. However, yeah, I just kind of wanted to go deep into that collective unease that we all went through over summer, feeling uncertain about our future. And it was linked to my own personal feelings about my own future and the world more generally. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't know about you. I assume it was the same for you, but living in the Blue Mountains, for me, it was people losing houses is awful, but for me, it was all the wildlife just being incinerated day after day. It just became quite crippling emotionally after a while, didn't it?
Yeah. The wildlife got to me as well, very much.
And then, of course, 2020 said, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Let's have a global pandemic as well, just to really kind of top things off. So at what point in this process, or in what point during the bushfires and so forth, did you go, this is something I need to write about? Was it partway through? Was it later on when you reflected back on it? Was it something that was bubbling away throughout the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I always tend to write about whatever is going on around me because I like to reflect the world. I find it interesting at the very least. I just happened to have a lot of time on my hands at that particular point in time. I was sort of between projects and feeling a bit not quite knowing what I was doing myself. So I thought I'd write a poem to try and turn that sense of confusion into something that made sense.
Just interested in what your response is now to the news that's come out today, that because El Nino has sort of passed us, now El Nino is upon us, we're now looking at a summer of floods rather than bushfires. What's your response to that?
It's almost biblical, doesn't it?
It is a little biblical. I'd like to ask you both something that I'm happy to put my hand up and say I'm a born-again atheist. And I wasn't eligible to write a poem for this competition anyway because I work at WestWords, but I did for a moment think, what would I write about if I was going to be writing about anything as an atheist? Would I be writing about coming out of faith, or what would it be? And then that idea of spirituality came up. And this is something I hear a lot from people who can't quite define their belief. They go, I don't believe in a God, but I am quite spiritual. What's your take on that whole idea? And did you come to this from a religious perspective, a spiritual perspective, or did you go, I can retrofit a poem to make it fit within those guidelines anyway? Or is all poetry just spiritual in its own way?
I have a really great friend. He's 111 years old, and his name's Henry Jacamara Cook. He lives at Lodgemanu. And one time he was telling me, was his favourite thing to tell me is that white people are insane. And I asked him why white people are insane. I've had 100 different answers to this question, all of which I think are valid. But he said, imagine there's a cat, and on the cat there are all these fleas, and the fleas are running around and they're building churches and they're going into the churches because they're looking for cat, and the stupid bastards are just standing on him.
That's great.
You know, we sit there looking for God, and we are standing on the most magnificent thing, particularly Australians. You know, we have this enormous sky, we have this huge kind of kaleidoscope of birds and native plants, and our country is breathtakingly beautiful. If there is such a thing as a miracle, you know, in the universe, we live in that miracle. So why it is that we then trap ourselves in a house searching for a different kind of miracle, one that looks like a kind of middle-aged white guy, I've never understood it.
That's sort of a slightly pantheist kind of view, really, isn't it?
I'm not sure that it is. I mean, it's taken me a while to arrive at, because, you know, I was raised without any knowledge whatsoever of our Indigenous ancestry, no knowledge. And I don't think it's possible for a person who's got some ancestry, even if they form very long-lasting relationships with community, to be an Aboriginal person. I don't, because we, you know, the building blocks of your nature have been put in you. But along with that comes this sense that I don't belong to any culture. So you think, well, I have taken myself out of white culture with this long search, but I can never fully belong to a black culture either. And the answer that I found was, I can belong to the country. Everybody on this country, whether they came from, you know, 75,000 years of tradition or not, negotiates their own relationship with the land. And when you do that, when you genuinely do it, when you go out into the country and you speak and you listen to see if the country speaks back to you, something changes. You're no longer somebody who's, you know, walking around on grass and under trees. You're walking in the company of these things. And it is something that you can see in front of you. You're not asked to take anything on faith.
For me, I guess the moment that kind of parallels with what you're talking about was when I did some work in just inland from Geraldton. So we're talking about, you know, Yalgoo and Meekatharra and areas like that. And we're flying in a small plane over to these small communities. And I remember looking out of that plane at the windows and that enormous horizon that was basically all the way around. And it suddenly struck me that if our plane were to crash land and we survived the crash, but we hadn't managed to get some kind of EPIRB off before we went in, we were kind of done for. It's an extraordinarily large place. And I think that was one of the moments, and I was in my 30s, that was one of the moments when I think I went, I think I kind of start to get it a little bit, maybe.
Yeah. You think if all three of us were sitting together here where we are 300 years ago, which isn't that long ago, we would have a roof over our heads because it would have been our birthright. We would have food that grew in the ground, and our time would be spent with our families, with the things that really mattered to us. But instead, we sell ourselves into slavery for a house that we should have anyway, while the food rots in the ground around us because we don't know how to find it, because we cling so much to our colonialism that we won't embrace the land that we live in now, despite it being this incredible land. This land could feed all of us, but we don't go looking for it.
What about you, Louise? What's your take on this whole idea of spirituality? How do you define that?
Well, I mean, as a child, my atheist parents sent me to a very Anglican school, which made me deeply confused from an early age. But I completely agree with Judith. I think it's very lucky to be here in Australia. I think it is a sacred country. The land is sacred, like as trite as that possibly sounds. I feel like there's great, the wildlife is amazing, and there's this energy in Australian places that comes into my writing when like you said, when I listen for it, I feel like it sort of just kind of flows, as possibly ridiculous as that sounds. But
where in Australia has been the place where you've most felt that?
I had an experience. I went to Cairns for the first time 3 years ago, and there was just something about it that really moved me. Just being there and walking around, that in particular stands out in my mind. Yeah.
What about you, Judith?
There's a place in the Great Sandy Desert called Minamina, which is the sacred women's place. And there's only been sort of 3 or 4 trips out there that people have made. And a couple of years ago, some friends and I took a bunch of old ladies from Yindamu and Lajamanu out there to Minamina. And it's going to be burned in my brain, I think, for the rest of my life. We arrived at these sacred salt lakes right at dusk, and the sun was coming down behind the salt lakes, and the old ladies had lit hunting fires all around to keep away snakes and dingoes, and they were out dancing on the salt lakes with the sun coming down behind them, and these giant desert oaks all around us. You know, at this place where, I don't know, maybe sort of 50 people have stood since settlement. And you just think this land is so vast and we're just all trapped in this little part of it because we think it's safe and we're frightened to go anywhere else. But there are these incredible places in this country, just magnificent places.
A piece of land as big as Australia, anywhere else in the world, would be completely covered with people, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Or would it be? I don't know. Maybe that desert is its own kind of self-contained inoculation against overpopulation. You've got to know what you're doing to live there.
Maybe.
So let's talk about your process. So Judith, you were talking earlier about the prose poem idea. What's your normal form for poetry when you're writing?
I normally write free verse kind of lyric poetry, I suppose you would call it. It's quite influenced, I guess, by the American style that we sort of imported here in the 80s and 90s.
Right. Such as whom?
Oh, I guess like Hayden Carruth. You know him?
No, I don't. Louise probably does, but I don't.
Oh, he was like this crazy American hillbilly guy who was an enormous communist and decided that nobody was ever going to create a society he could be part of. So he went and lived in this old shack down by the river and just wrote poems about how much he loved birds and his wife. With a little bit of communist bitterness creeping in there. You know, yeah.
I'm not sure how those three things can possibly collide, but I guess they must have. Who else do you really rate in that kind of field of poetry?
Well, obviously, Louise Brooke, you know, who's just won the Nobel Prize. I mean, She's just stunning. Absolutely. She just takes my breath away with her emotional bravery. And I guess, you know, what I like about those poets in particular is this embracing of their fears and vulnerabilities and self-loathing. They find the things about themselves that are perhaps the weakest things, and they write them down and publish them, and they kill their demons that way. But they don't just do that. They give other people permission as well to see those things in themselves and embrace those things as well. So it's almost like an antidote to shame in a way, you know, and you get to see the beautiful part of ordinary life. Nobody's pretending to be, you know, a noble person or the president of the United States or Nietzsche or anything like that. They're just talking about their own lives unapologetically. And when a person does that with absolute honesty, I think it can be really transcendent.
What about you, Louise? What's your preferred sort of style, if you like, and the way you approach your poetry?
I started out writing free verse, but I've become increasingly interested in formal structures just because of the patterning of it. The pantoum in particular, I really love. I read Stephen Fry's book, The Ode Less Travelled, which taught me a lot about meter that I didn't quite understand before. And it's just, the poem that I submitted to the Blake, it's written in couplets. And it was sort of directly inspired by a David Malouf poem called Suburban. which is also written in couplets, and it explores, similar to what Judith was saying, kind of the everyday, the suburban, the ordinary, but finding that which is sort of profound within that.
At what point was that creative decision made to structure it in that way?
I mean, I work in a bookstore part-time, so that David Malouf collection found its way into my hands, and I just flipped it open. And I have quite this mystical approach to poetry where poems find me. I feel like they have something to say to me. So that one just caught my attention. I thought it was really beautiful. So I then decided I wanted to write something in that couplet form in a similar kind of way.
And what would you normally write about?
I mean, I started writing poetry as a way of exploring intense emotional states. Basically, a lot of breakup poetry was my entry into the art form. But I've since discovered that there is a lot more nuance in things that are less kind of emotionally dramatic.
And do either of you, when you write when you write prose, do you find that your poetry experience plays into that?
I mean, I used to be a copywriter. I used to write retail copy for appliances, and I had feedback from a boss that said that my fridge copy would rhyme, and I'd read it back and I noticed that it was quite embarrassing.
I used to work, when I was a registered nurse, I used to work with someone who he wanted to be a poet, and he used to try and work these sort of flowery purple phrases into his end of shift reports. And I remember one time he wrote that he'd performed a rectal exam on one poor gentleman. He said, and a barren wasteland was found therein. That's a lovely image. Thank you for that.
I love being poetic in text messages. Sometimes I just do it to be ridiculous, like a ridiculously rhyming text message that's talking about something like picking up milk.
So Judith, what's your normal subject topic? Do you have one in particular that you work towards?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to know what your own topic is because you don't always see it. I remember when I first sent my first book of poems off to get copyrighted, and I sent it to a friend who's very good at this kind of thing, and he called me and he said, "Why do you have all these animals with antlers?" And I had no idea what he was talking about.
Animals with antlers.
Yeah.
Well, like mooses
I had
and things.
elk and deer and antelopes and all these things appearing, and I didn't know. I had no idea. That it's a lot of the things that you intend to come out in the poem, and then all this stuff in the back of your head comes out too. But I guess overall, if I were to sort of look at everything, I've been writing a lot about resilience. Not resilience in terms of gritting your teeth and getting through something, but in terms of being able to see bleak situations, trying to find the light in them, because there usually is light in these bleak situations. It's very hard to do that without coming across as a really annoying optimist.
Sure, but I mean, as someone who's had the odd, slightly awkward and unpleasant experience with slam poetry, I kind of feel like a lot of people who do slam could probably look for some resilience in their poetry rather than just sort of caving to these awful negative emotions.
Can be bleak.
And being bleak, yeah. I like that idea of resilience.
I guess when you're writing, one question that occurs, it certainly has with me, is to what extent am I giving and to what extent am I taking? And so if I'm going to unleash on the world a collection of poems which is just me binging, then I feel like I'm taking more than I'm giving. Whereas if I sort of try to use my own experience to find a framework for which other people can maybe, even if they're just realizing you can get through something because somebody else has, or realizing that kind of suffering can allow a person to transform into something else, then I feel like maybe I'm equaling out that balance somehow between giving and taking.
I find that interesting that you're talking about giving and taking. For myself as a poet, there's very little that I'm writing that is for anyone else. Is your audience foremost in your mind when either of you are writing your poetry?
I don't think any poet really writes with an audience per se in mind. I mean, I kind of see it, coming back to the previous topic, as a kind of conversation with God, like a sort of a questioning the void. I like to call it pestering the oracle.
That may well become the title of this particular interview, I think. Pestering the oracle. I like that. And what are you pestering the oracle about? What are you asking the oracle to provide?
Well, I mean, that poem, the Blake poem, is a good example where I kind of was looking for answers in my own way and looking for a way out of kind of quite a dark headspace. And the poem did give that to me in those last two lines, that just kind of, I had that experience of that just materializing as the end of the poem. And it gave me this tangible feeling of like a spine tingling kind of moment of feeling like there was something meaningful out there and it wasn't just meaningless and bleak, basically.
I mean, I guess in a funny sort of way, both your poems, each of you in your poems do reach a point of, well, in Louise's case, there is that point of hope in the last two lines where you say, pay attention to whatever isn't pain and the room expands with subdued brightness. And Judith, in your case, it's not so much, well, there is a sense of hope, but it's actually more a sense of acceptance and realization and epiphany, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about, I guess, having the courage to speak because, let's say as a person of mixed ancestry, I decided to identify as white and then write these long poems about how great it is to be a white person. I may as well, call myself a white supremacist. It's like that. So once you have this knowledge that there's something there, you have a responsibility and you either speak it, which requires quite a lot of bravery, I think, because the landscape is nuanced, or you conceal it. And concealing it would have felt to me like participating in a kind of a cultural genocide in a way. So then you have to ask yourself, what prevents people from speaking? All of these people across this country that have got connections, in their ancestry to Aboriginal people, why don't they all speak? And it's because it's confronting and, you're afraid that you're going to become a target and somebody's going to tell you that you don't look black enough or, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It becomes a difficult thing to negotiate.
Because I think about each of your poems, each of your respective poems, and I do a little thought experiment where I imagine that that moment of epiphany in Judith's case and moment of hope in your case, Louise, I kind of do a little thought experiment where I imagine those poems without those moments at the end, and suddenly it's all almost too bleak to even contemplate without those moments. Do you think that is the moment when you realise that that poem is ready to go into the world, when you've reached that moment of circling back, or the character arc, if you like, to try and put it in a more prosaic kind of sense? Because I think we're always, as poets, we're always looking for how we know it's done.
I think personally that poetry is trying to seek some kind of epiphany, that something needs to happen inside the poem that you couldn't predict exactly. But that wouldn't be the point at which I would say it's done. I would say that's definitely a poem worth persevering with, but you probably have work to do with other aspects of it. But
yeah, I probably would advise against going, I think that one's done, we'll send that today, right? Probably.
I did have a typo in my submission for the Blake, which annoyed me for the entire time that it was with judges. And then
you're going to tell me which one it was?
It was the word. It said pepper energy in my original submission. It was meant to be peppery energy, and it's a tiny difference, but it really bugged me. And I had to email the guy and say, "Could you please make one change?" Because I just hit click too fast.
We all do that occasionally. And Judith, how do you know when it's done, or how do you know when something's worth persevering with? Is it when you've gone through all the kind of the dark stuff, and then you go, here's my moment that either reflects back on what this has been about, or sort of casts the mind forward to where this could lead?
I always begin writing a poem from a position of not knowing what I think, of really just having no idea. And there's there's something floating out there that I can see a little bit, but enough to start moving towards it, but I don't really understand. I don't understand what it is, and I don't understand what I think. And when it becomes clear to me through the poem that I'm writing, when I can read back that poem and I know what I think, that's when I know the poem's finished.
Have you ever tried to write a poem to say something that you knew you were going to say?
No, I've never written anything that I knew what I was going to say in the first place. Because to me, I wouldn't see the point in it. That feels like advertising rather than poetry. Poetry is more of an exploration.
Well, that's why it's fun and addictive as well. There's the unknown, and it teaches you something every time, I think.
I know that certainly in creative writing for school students, I've always been very anxious to explain to them that the story you think you're telling is not necessarily the one that you're going to end up telling at the end. And I suppose that's how we keep ourselves interested. And I guess if you don't do that, then you risk becoming Bryce Courtney, who said, "I don't write books, I write Christmas gifts."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you just create monuments to your own vanity, aren't you? Really, you sort of.
That's another really good way to put it. So, what's next for you all with your poetry? Are you is it just continue to be a lifelong pursuit of the perfect couplet, or the moment of epiphany, or getting your verse on an ad for perfume? What's the long game here?
Well, obviously, I'm going to make heaps of money.
Yeah, well, of course.
That's my number one goal. Yeah.
Of course, that's what poets do, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's okay. I mean, that's what I love about it, that it's not, you can't commodify it, basically. And I think that when you have a day job, it enriches your life, and then that goes into your poetry. So
Judith, what's next for you? Just more of the same?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think poetry arises from a different set of values, essentially. So, you know, if what I really, really wanted was, 5 boats to, tow behind my Porsche, I wouldn't be a poet. So, in a sense, the things that I'm looking for are different things. And I guess it's the riches of being allowed to be a creative person and continuing to be a creative person. The beauty of poetry is that you don't really end up in a trap where you've got this kind of audience that expects something from you and the creativity is being diluted by that. So you do have an enormous amount of freedom as a poet to explore all of those, spaces in your mind or spaces in society, whatever it is that you're writing about. And so for me, I guess, I'm writing a book at the moment. It's like a giant verse novel. It's like an Australian fairy story for grown-ups.
Right.
And pursuing that enables me to have this kind of layer of magic in my life, because I'm thinking in those terms about it. It changes the whole way that I go through my life. And I think maybe with all poets it's a little bit like that. Like poetry is not a completely transparent lens, in a sense. It colors the things that we look at as poets.
So thank you both so much for chatting with us. Congratulations once again. 480, that's a lot of people. So congratulations to both of you for finding your way to the top of that particular pile of excellent writing. I read a lot of the entries and there were some very good ones in there, but these two came out on the top. So congratulations once again. Thank you for talking to us today. And continue, what was the term you used, Louise? Continue...
Pestering the oracle.
Pestering the oracle, yeah. Pester away. Thanks so much, guys, for talking to us. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.